My name is Sydney. I am 26 years old, and 3 months ago I buried my husband. Just weeks after his funeral, I forced myself to attend my nephew's first birthday party, hoping for a moment of family normalcy. Instead, right after the cake was cut, my sister clinked her glass, pulled out a legal document, and announced to 50 guests that my dead husband was the father of her baby. She demanded half of my $1 million home as child support for his supposed rightful heir. She smiled, waiting for me to collapse in tears. She did not know I am a forensic accountant, and the financial web I was about to untangle would leave her completely bankrupt and homeless by sunset. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who tried to take advantage of your grief. It had been exactly 90 days since the highway patrol officer knocked on my front door to tell me Declan's car had hydroplaned off the interstate. He was only 29. We had been married for 2 beautiful, peaceful years. The grief was a physical weight on my chest, a crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe on most mornings. But I am not someone who falls apart. My career as a forensic accountant requires me to remain analytical, cold, and composed under pressure. I track missing millions for corporate clients. I look for the truth hidden in the numbers. I do not let emotions cloud my judgment. That analytical mindset was the only thing keeping me upright as I walked up the driveway to my sister Melanie's massive suburban estate. She and her husband Jamal lived in a custom-built home in an upscale neighborhood. Jamal is a highly successful architect, a brilliant and kind African-American man who poured his heart into designing every square inch of that property. He was a good husband and an amazing father to little Leo. The party was extravagant, exactly the kind of show-off event Melanie lived for. There was a catered buffet, a professional photographer, and a towering 3-tier cake that cost more than my first car. I stood near the back of the spacious living room, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The house was packed with our relatives, Jamal's family, and half of Melanie's country club friends. I kept a low profile, wearing a simple black dress, my wedding band still heavy on my left hand. I just wanted to drop off my gift, wish my nephew a happy birthday, and escape back to the quiet safety of my own home. My house is a stunning, fully paid-off property in a gated community, something Declan and I worked incredibly hard to secure. The afternoon was progressing normally until Melanie decided it was time for the spotlight. She signaled the caterers to clear the plates and stood at the head of the massive marble kitchen island. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it against her crystal champagne glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing cut through the chatter. The room quieted down, turning their attention to the beaming hostess. Jamal stood a few feet away, holding little baby Leo, smiling proudly at his wife. I expected a toast. I expected her to thank everyone for coming and to brag about how advanced Leo was for his age. Instead, her smile slowly morphed into an expression of calculated sorrow. She let out a dramatic, trembling sigh and looked directly at me across the room. Every eye followed her gaze. "Family and friends," Melanie began, her voice quivering with fake emotion. "Today is a day of celebration, but it is also a day of hard truths. I have carried a heavy burden for over a year now, and I can no longer live a lie. Not when my son's future is at stake." Jamal furrowed his brow, stepping forward with a confused look on his face. "Melanie, what are you talking about?" he asked softly. She ignored him completely. She reached into the pocket of her expensive silk trousers and pulled out a thick, folded piece of paper. She slammed it down onto the marble island with a loud smack. "Sydney," she said, her voice suddenly turning sharp and authoritative. "I am so sorry to do this publicly, but you have been ignoring my calls. I need you to know the truth about your perfect husband. Declan and I had an affair. Leo is not Jamal's son. Leo is Declan's biological child." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a tornado. Someone in the back dropped a fork and it clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Jamal physically stumbled backward, clutching the baby to his chest, his face freezing in absolute shock. He looked down at Leo, a child with pale skin, bright blue eyes, and tufts of blonde hair. Jamal had always joked that genetics were funny, assuming the baby just strongly took after Melanie's side of the family. Now the implication hung in the air like a poisonous gas. "Are you insane?" a voice whispered from the crowd. I heard one of my aunts gasp loudly. "But she is only 26 and just buried him," another guest muttered. Melanie did not flinch at the whispers. She stood taller, reveling in the chaos she had just ignited. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the document on the counter. "This is Declan's last will and testament," she announced loudly. "He signed it a week before his accident. He knew about Leo. He felt guilty. In this document, he explicitly names Leo as his rightful heir. And as the executor of his estate, I am legally demanding 50% of your house, Sydney. You live in a $1 million property that was bought with marital funds. Half of that belongs to my son to ensure he is properly cared for." She crossed her arms, a triumphant sneer playing on her lips. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to break down crying, run out of the house, and surrender out of sheer humiliation. Throughout our entire lives, Melanie was the golden child who thrived on making me the scapegoat. If she broke a vase, she blamed me. If she overdrew her bank account, she stole my savings. She expected me to crumble just like I did when we were kids. But I was not a child anymore. I did not cry. My heart rate barely even elevated. I slowly set my glass of water down on a side table. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as I walked calmly toward the kitchen island. I could feel dozens of eyes burning into my skin, waiting for the dramatic confrontation. Jamal was staring at me, his eyes pleading for me to tell him this was a sick joke. I reached the island and picked up the piece of paper. The paper felt cheap. The font was standard, likely downloaded from a generic legal template website. I scanned the paragraphs, my eyes instantly catching the poorly drafted legal jargon, the missing notary stamps, and the glaring inconsistencies in the formatting. My brain naturally categorizes data, and this document was screaming fraud. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It was a decent forgery, but the ink weight was entirely wrong. Declan was left-handed and always pressed heavily on the left side of his loops. This signature was light and fluid, clearly traced by a right-handed person trying too hard to be precise. I looked up from the paper, locking eyes with my sister. I did not yell. I did not curse. I simply tilted my head, gave her a slow, amused smirk, and spoke in a clear, carrying voice. "Oh, I see. Tell me, Melanie, exactly how much money did you pay the amateur who printed this garbage?" Before Melanie could even open her mouth to stammer a reply, a manicured hand slammed down onto the marble island right next to mine. It was our mother, Beatrice. Her face was flushed dark red with anger, her heavy gold jewelry clanking as she positioned herself directly between me and my sister. Beatrice had spent her entire life acting as Melanie's personal bodyguard, shielding her golden child from any and all consequences. "How dare you speak to your sister that way?" Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "Your husband is barely cold in the ground and you are standing here disrespecting his final wishes. You are a cold, unfeeling machine, Sydney. You always have been." I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly straight and looked my mother dead in the eye. She hated that. She hated that she could never make me cry. Beatrice turned to the crowd playing to her audience. "Look at her," she yelled, gesturing wildly in my direction. "She does not shed a single tear for her dead husband. Do you want to know why Declan turned to Melanie? Do you want to know the truth? Because Sydney is a barren workaholic. While she was buried in her spreadsheets and her little calculator games, Melanie offered him warmth. Melanie gave him the one thing Sydney never could: a child, a real family." A collective gasp rippled through the expansive living room. It was one thing to claim an affair, but it was another to publicly shame your own grieving daughter for supposedly being unable to conceive. I saw Jamal flinch out of the corner of my eye. He stepped forward again, still clutching little Leo, his face a mask of absolute horror. "Beatrice, stop," Jamal demanded, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "You are crossing a line. This is insane." "Stay out of this, Jamal," Beatrice snapped back, completely dismissing the man who owned the very house she was standing in. She turned her vitriol back to me. "Declan was a man, Sydney. A man with needs. He needed a real woman, not a robot who treats her marriage like a business transaction. Melanie stepped up when you failed." My mother took a step closer to me, her anger boiling over because I was still just standing there observing her like a specimen under a microscope. In a sudden, aggressive movement, she reached out and snatched my black leather purse right off my shoulder. She gripped it tightly against her chest, treating it like a hostage. It was a classic Beatrice move. Physical intimidation mixed with boundary violations. "You owe your sister!" Beatrice screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "You have always been selfish. You owe her this house just like you owed her your college fund when she needed a wedding. Family sacrifices for family." Her words hung in the air, a stunning admission of a decade-old betrayal. When I was 18, I was accepted into a top-tier accounting program at a prestigious university. I had saved exactly $18,000 working 2 jobs throughout high school, sacrificing my weekends and summers to secure my future. The money was sitting in a joint account my mother insisted on opening for me when I was a minor. The week before my tuition was due, Melanie got engaged to her first husband, a marriage that barely lasted 2 years. My mother drained every single penny of my college fund to pay for Melanie's extravagant destination wedding. When I confronted them crying and begging for my tuition money, Beatrice told me I was being greedy. She said Melanie's happiness was more important than my degree and that I could just go to community college. I had to take out massive student loans and work grueling night shifts to put myself through school. I never forgave them, and I completely separated my finances from them the day I turned 18. I looked at my purse clutched in my mother's hands, her knuckles white with entitlement. Then I looked at the fake will on the counter. My forensic accountant brain was already processing the variables, calculating the exact trajectory of their miserable little plot. They thought because I was grieving, I would be weak and compliant. They thought they could blindside me with a forged document and public humiliation, banking on the fact that I would sign over half my assets just to make the screaming stop. They severely miscalculated. I do not break under pressure. I investigate it. I stepped forward, closing the distance between me and my mother. I did not yell. I did not grab her aggressively. I simply reached out, clamped my hand firmly around the strap of my purse, and pulled it back with a sharp, authoritative yank. The leather strap slid right out of her grasp. She stumbled forward, slightly shocked by the sheer force of my calm resistance. "Do not ever put your hands on my property again," I said softly, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper that only she could hear clearly. I turned my attention back to the piece of paper on the kitchen island. I ran my index finger over the ink of the signature. It was a printed copy, but even a copy told a glaring story. Besides the wrong pressure on the loops, the date of the signature was impossible. The document claimed Declan signed it in the presence of a notary on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 days before his accident. But my mind instantly pulled up the timeline. That Tuesday, Declan and I were on a flight to Chicago for a corporate real estate seminar. We boarded at noon and did not land until late evening. There was zero mathematical or geographical possibility that he sat in a room in our hometown with Melanie and a notary to sign away his life assets. "You took my college fund because I was a naive teenager," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room so every guest could hear every single syllable. "But I am a senior forensic accountant now, Beatrice. I track financial fraud for a living. I expose criminals who think they are smarter than the paper trail they leave behind. And this paper trail," I tapped the fake will with my fingernail. "This is an absolute insult to my intelligence." Melanie's face paled slightly, the confident smirk slipping just a fraction of an inch. She exchanged a panicked glance with someone standing near the kitchen entrance, a man in a tailored gray suit. "It is a legal document," Melanie insisted, though her voice had lost its earlier bravado. "It is notarized. You cannot fight the law, Sydney." "I am not fighting the law," I replied smoothly. "I am looking at a felony." Beatrice stepped forward again, raising her hand as if she was going to slap me. "You ungrateful brat! You will give your sister what she is owed." Before Beatrice could swing her hand, Jamal placed himself between us. He was a tall, imposing man, and his patience had completely evaporated. He glared down at his mother-in-law. "Do not touch her," Jamal warned, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying calm. "If you raise your hand to Sydney in my house again, I will have you physically removed." Jamal then turned to his wife. The look of adoration he usually reserved for Melanie was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, hard scrutiny. He looked at the blonde baby in his arms, then at the piece of paper, and finally at the woman he had married. Melanie, Jamal said, his voice cracking slightly. I'm going to ask you this once. Who wrote that document? Melanie stared at her husband. The confident, triumphant glow that had illuminated her face just moments ago completely evaporated. She looked at Jamal, then at me, realizing that her meticulous plan to ambush me had backfired spectacularly into her own marriage. She had expected Jamal to blindly support her, to stand by her side against the cold, unfeeling sister. Instead, Jamal was looking at her like she was a stranger who had just broken into his home. Jamal did not raise his voice, which made his anger even more terrifying. He stood perfectly still, his broad shoulders tense, the muscles in his jaw ticking. He looked down at the baby in his arms. Leo cooed, completely oblivious to the destruction of his family. Jamal looked at the boy's pale skin, the bright blue eyes, the soft tufts of blonde hair. For a year, Jamal had defended those features. He had proudly told his friends about genetics skipping generations. Now the truth was crashing down on him in front of 50 guests. Melanie, Jamal repeated, his voice dropping an octave. Look at me. Is this a joke? Because if this is some twisted game you are playing to get back at your sister, you need to tell me right now. That was the moment Melanie deployed her ultimate weapon. I had seen her do it 1,000 times growing up. Whenever she was backed into a corner and caught in a lie, she weaponized her tears. Her lower lip began to tremble. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, a perfect imitation of a panic attack. Her eyes filled with water, and before Jamal could demand another answer, her knees buckled. Melanie collapsed onto the expensive hardwood floor, her designer dress pooling around her. She buried her face in her hands and let out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed through the massive living room. I am so sorry, Melanie wailed, her voice muffled by her hands. She reached out and grabbed the hem of Jamal's trousers, clinging to him like a drowning woman. I did not want to tell you like this. I did not want anyone to know. But I had to protect Leo. Jamal tried to step back, but she held on tight, looking up at him with tear-streaked cheeks. It was not an affair, Jamal. It was not consensual. I would never betray you. I love you. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. The guests, who had just been whispering about a scandalous affair and a fake will, were now suddenly confronted with an accusation of assault. My mother, Beatrice, gasped loudly and pressed her hand to her chest. It happened last year, Melanie cried, her voice trembling violently. When you were in Seattle for that architecture convention, I was here alone. Declan came over. He said he needed to borrow some tools for a home repair project. I let him in. I thought we were family. I trusted him. She paused, letting out another gut-wrenching sob, expertly orchestrating the pacing of her lie. He cornered me in the kitchen. I told him to stop. I told him to leave. But he was so much stronger than me. He forced himself on me, Jamal. He forced himself on me, and he told me if I ever said a word, he would ruin our lives. He said no one would believe me over the perfect grieving widow. Melanie pointed a shaking finger at me. He was a monster, Sydney. Your husband was a monster. And when I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. I did not know what to do. I let you believe Leo was yours, Jamal, because I could not bear to lose you. But then Declan died, and I found that will. He wanted to make it right for the child he forced onto me. The psychological manipulation was nothing short of a masterclass. In less than 2 minutes, Melanie had completely rewritten the narrative. She was no longer the greedy, cheating sister trying to steal $1 million home. She was the tragic victim of a brutal assault, suffering in silence, fiercely protecting her family from a predatory brother-in-law. And I was suddenly the villain, the oblivious wife of a rapist holding onto assets that rightfully belonged to a child born of trauma. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The crowd loves a victim. I could hear the murmurs changing tone. Eyes that had been glaring at Melanie just moments ago were now looking at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. My mother, Beatrice, did not miss a beat. She rushed forward and dropped to her knees beside Melanie, throwing her arms around her golden child. My poor baby, Beatrice cried loudly, stroking Melanie's hair. You carried this horrible secret all by yourself. You survived this nightmare, and you... Beatrice snapped her head toward me, her eyes flashing with pure hatred. Your disgusting husband violated your sister. You should be on your knees begging for her forgiveness. You owe her every single penny to make up for the trauma your husband caused. Jamal looked physically sick. He was swaying slightly on his feet, his mind violently rejecting the information while simultaneously trying to process the magnitude of the accusation. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. He was a good man, a protector by nature. The idea that his wife had been assaulted in their own home while he was away was destroying him. He wanted to comfort her. He wanted to believe her. I watched Melanie bury her face in our mother's shoulder. I could not see her eyes, but I knew she was waiting for me to break. She had played the ultimate trump card. In modern society, you do not question a victim. You do not demand proof when a woman is sobbing on the floor about an assault. If I fought back now, I would look like a monster defending a predator. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to remain completely objective when people use high emotion to obscure the facts. Fraudsters always try to overwhelm you with drama to distract you from the data. But data does not cry. Data does not lie. And I had all the data I needed. I did not raise my voice. I did not act defensive. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, placing myself directly between the sobbing pile of my mother and sister and the devastated husband holding the baby. "Jamal," I said softly, my voice completely steady. "Look at me." Jamal tore his eyes away from Melanie and looked at me. His face was a portrait of pure agony. "Do not let her poison your mind," I said, making sure my words carried across the silent judging room. "Do not let her break your heart with a story she just invented 30 seconds ago." "How can you be so cruel?" Beatrice screamed from the floor. "She was assaulted." I ignored my mother completely. I kept my eyes locked on Jamal. I reached into my purse, bypassing the fake will that was still sitting on the counter. "Melanie is an incredible actress," I said calmly, addressing both Jamal and the 50 guests who were hanging on my every word. "But her timeline has a fatal biological flaw. She claims Declan came to this house. She claims he overpowered her and forced himself on her, resulting in this child." I looked down at my sister, who had suddenly stopped sobbing. She slowly lifted her head from Beatrice's shoulder. The panic in her eyes was real now. "Declan never touched you, Melanie," I stated, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. "Because he couldn't." A sharp murmur swept through the room, the guests exchanging bewildered glances. Melanie froze, her fake tears drying up instantly as her mind scrambled to process what I had just said. She opened her mouth to speak, to pivot her lie, but before she could formulate another word, a man pushed his way to the front of the crowd. "That is quite enough," a slick, condescending voice called out. I turned to see Trent stepping into the clearing. Trent was a local lawyer and public notary who had been orbiting my sister and Jamal's social circle for the past 2 years. He was a tall man with pale skin, striking blue eyes, and carefully styled blonde hair. He always wore suits that were slightly too tight and carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room. I knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, I knew his reputation. He was the kind of bottom-feeding attorney who handled petty civil disputes and rubber-stamped questionable documents for a quick fee. Trent adjusted his silk tie and walked straight over to the kitchen island, placing his hand protectively over the forged document Melanie had slapped down earlier. He looked at me with a patronizing smirk, the kind of look a teacher gives a slow student. "Sydney," Trent said, using a tone of false sympathy. "We all understand that grief makes people say irrational things. Losing a spouse is a traumatic event, and denial is a very common first stage. But we are not here to debate medical impossibilities or hurl accusations at a traumatized woman. We are here to execute the law." Jamal stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Who invited you here, Trent? This is a private family matter." "I invited myself, Jamal," Trent replied smoothly, not even making eye contact with the man whose house he was standing in. "As the legal executor of Declan's newly discovered last will and testament, I have a fiduciary duty to ensure his final wishes are carried out promptly and without interference. And right now, Sydney is interfering." Trent opened a slim leather briefcase he had carried with him and pulled out a fresh stack of papers, heavily marked with yellow sticky notes. He laid them out on the marble counter in a neat row. "I'm going to make this very simple for you, Sydney," Trent continued, launching into his rehearsed intimidation tactic. "This will names Leo as the primary beneficiary of half your marital assets. That means 50% of the equity in your home belongs to this child. If you attempt to contest this document, I will immediately file an injunction in probate court. I will place a lien on your property by Tuesday morning. I will petition the judge to freeze every single liquid asset you possess, right down to your grocery money, pending a full forensic audit of the estate. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the counter, trying to physically dominate the space. You will not be able to sell the house. You will not be able to access your funds. You will spend the next 3 years drowning in legal fees, and in the end, the judge will rule in favor of the biological child anyway. The court always favors the child, Sydney. You know this. Do not destroy your own life just because you are angry. He tapped the stack of papers with a manicured finger. Or we can handle this quietly, right here, right now. I have prepared a quitclaim deed and a transfer of equity agreement. You sign these papers transferring 50% ownership of the property to a trust managed by Melanie for Leo's benefit. You do that, and the frozen assets threat goes away. You get to keep your half, and nobody has to read about this messy affair in the local public records. It was a classic shakedown. Isolate the target, create an overwhelming sense of impending doom, throw around heavy legal jargon, and offer a quick exit that just so happens to cost the victim everything. To an ordinary person, the threat of having their bank accounts frozen and a lien placed on their home would be absolutely terrifying. They would panic. They would sign anything to make the threat go away. My mother saw her opening. Beatrice scrambled up from the floor, smoothing down her skirt, her eyes locking onto the papers like a predator spotting wounded prey. She grabbed a silver pen from the counter, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. Beatrice marched over to me, her face inches from mine. "You heard the lawyer," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Do not be stupid. We have a standing in this community. My friends are in this room right now watching you act like a stubborn child. If you drag us through a public court battle over a bastard child, you will ruin our family reputation forever. Do you want your dead husband's name dragged through the mud? Do you want everyone in this town to know he preferred your sister over you?" She grabbed my right wrist with her free hand, her acrylic nails digging painfully into my skin. She tried to pry my fingers open, attempting to physically force the pen into my hand. "Sign the paper, Sydney," Beatrice demanded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "Sign the damn paper right now and give your sister what she is owed. Stop being so incredibly selfish. Do it for the family." I looked at the pen. I looked at the red marks my mother's fingernails were leaving on my skin. Then I looked at Trent, who was standing there with that insufferable, smug look on his pale face, fully believing he had just checkmated a grieving widow. The sheer audacity of their performance was breathtaking. The absolute arrogance it took to walk into another man's house, present a forged document, and try to strong-arm a forensic accountant into signing away $1 million asset. It was so incredibly stupid that my professional composure finally cracked. I did not yell. I did not cry. I threw my head back and let out a loud, genuine laugh. The sound echoed through the silent room, startling everyone. Beatrice dropped my wrist as if she had been burned, stumbling backward with a look of utter confusion. Trent's smug smile vanished, replaced by a deep, sudden unease. People who are trapped do not laugh. People who are intimidated do not laugh like that. "You think this is funny?" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking with outrage. "I think it is hilarious," I said, wiping a small tear of mirth from the corner of my eye. I unzipped the main compartment of my purse and reached inside. "You brought a knife to a gunfight, Trent, and you did not even bother to check if the knife was sharp." I pulled out my sleek silver iPad and tapped the screen to wake it up. "You want to talk about legal premises and property liens? Let us talk about them." I looked right at the lawyer, my smile fading into a look of absolute icy destruction. "Because you are about to lose your license to practice law." Trent scoffed, attempting to maintain his posture, but I saw a brief flicker of uncertainty behind his eyes. He shifted his weight and puffed out his chest. "Big words for a number cruncher. I am a licensed attorney, Sydney. You cannot intimidate me with an iPad. A legal will supersedes whatever spreadsheets you have saved on that screen." "A legal will only supersedes matters within its jurisdiction," I corrected him, tapping a file folder icon on my screen. "But an amateur forgery distributing assets that do not exist, that is a textbook case of extortion. And as a licensed attorney, you really should have done a basic public records search before you marched into a party to threaten me." I turned the iPad around so the bright screen faced Trent. I made sure to hold it high enough so Jamal, my mother, and the closest guests could clearly see the illuminated document. It was a digital copy of a property deed, complete with the official watermarks of the county clerk's office. Let me educate you on the fatal flaw in your little master plan, I said, my voice carrying the sharp, authoritative edge I used in corporate audit meetings. You came here demanding 50% of my home. You drafted this fake will claiming Declan wanted to leave his half of our marital assets to this child. But there is a massive gaping hole in your legal premise. Declan did not own my house. Trent blinked, his brow furrowing. That is a lie. You purchased that property after you were married. It is community property by default. It was, I clarified, enjoying the slight tremor that was starting to form in Trent's hands. Until 2 years ago, right around the time someone in our family circle got a little too greedy. I looked directly at Melanie. She was still sitting on the floor next to our mother, but she had stopped playing the weeping victim. She was staring at me with wide, panicked eyes. 2 years ago, I continued, projecting my voice to the entire room. Someone stole Declan's social security number. They used his identity to apply for 3 premium credit cards with a combined limit of $40,000. They were very sloppy. As a forensic accountant, it took me exactly 4 hours to trace the IP address of those applications. Strangely enough, the digital footprint bounced right back to the Wi-Fi router in this exact house. Jamal whipped his head around to look at Melanie. What? He breathed out, the betrayal deepening on his face. Melanie opened her mouth like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single word of denial. Because of that massive security breach, I said, turning my attention back to the suddenly sweating lawyer, I convinced Declan that we needed to bulletproof our assets. We did not just freeze his credit, we completely restructured our financial portfolio. I hired a top-tier estate firm in the city, not a strip mall notary like you, Trent. We dissolved our joint ownership of the million-dollar property. We took the house, our investment accounts, and all major liquid assets and transferred them entirely into an irrevocable trust. Trent actually took a physical step backward. The smugness was completely gone from his pale face, replaced by the sheer terror of a man realizing he had just stepped on a legal landmine. Do you know what an irrevocable trust is, Trent? I asked, leaning slightly over the marble counter. Of course you do, but let me explain it for the guests. When you place a property into an irrevocable trust, you surrender all ownership rights to that property. It ceases to belong to you. It belongs to the trust. And I am the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary of that trust. The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the hum of the central air conditioning and the soft breathing of the stunned guests. That means, I said, driving the final nail into his coffin. For the last 2 years, Declan did not own a single brick of that house. He did not own the driveway. He did not own the roof. He had absolutely zero legal equity to his name. So when you drafted this pathetic forged will, you had a dead man bequeathing property he legally did not possess. I slapped my hand flat on the marble counter right next to his fake document. The sharp smack made Trent jump. You cannot distribute imaginary assets, Trent, I stated coldly. A will cannot touch an irrevocable trust. You are standing in front of 50 witnesses trying to use a fraudulent document to extort a $1 million trust fund. That is not a civil dispute. That is federal wire fraud. That is criminal extortion. And the State Bar Association is going to have an absolute field day disbarring you before you go to prison. Trent turned a sickly shade of gray. All the blood completely drained from his face. His mouth opened and closed silently. He looked down at his yellow sticky notes, his legal threats crumbling into dust. He had trusted Melanie's word about their finances, and his own arrogance had blinded him from doing a simple title search. He had walked right into a trap built by a woman who analyzed fraud for a living. You did not check the deed, I whispered, my voice dripping with disdain. Did you? You just printed a template, forged a dead man's signature, and thought you could bully a grieving widow into signing a quitclaim deed. You thought I was weak. Beatrice, who had been listening to this financial execution in stunned silence, finally found her voice. But it was no longer the loud, demanding shriek of an entitled mother. It was the shaky, uncertain whisper of someone watching their golden child's plan go up in flames. Melanie, Beatrice asked, her voice trembling as she looked down at her favorite daughter. What is she talking about? What trust? You said the house was half his. Melanie did not answer. She was hyperventilating, staring at the floor. The promise of a $500,000 payout had evaporated into thin air, replaced by the crushing reality of impending criminal charges. But Melanie was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always lash out with whatever weapon they have left. She could not get the house, but she still had her other angle. She still had the baby. Melanie suddenly scrambled to her feet, her hands balled into tight fists, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure desperation. She lunged forward, grabbing a folded piece of paper from her pocket that she had been saving for this exact moment. She threw it aggressively across the counter toward me. "Fine!" Melanie screamed, her voice completely unhinged. "Keep the damn house. Hide behind your trusts. But you cannot hide your future income. I will sue your estate for retroactive child support. I will demand $10,000 a month for the rest of his life. Because no matter what legal tricks you play, you cannot change biology." She pointed at the paper she had just thrown. "That is a DNA test, and it proves Leo shares familial DNA with your dead husband." The folded piece of paper fluttered through the tense air and landed squarely on the polished marble of the kitchen island, right next to the fraudulent will Trent had brought. The room erupted into frantic whispers all over again. My mother Beatrice, who had just been staring at her golden child in absolute horror, suddenly found a renewed sense of arrogant hope. Her posture straightened, and she shot me a smug, vindicated glare. To her, this piece of paper was the ultimate trump card. If Melanie could prove biological ties, the technicalities of my trust fund would not matter in the court of public opinion, and they certainly would not stop a hungry family court judge. Melanie stepped away from our mother and marched right up to the other side of the island. Her face was streaked with ruined makeup, her eyes wild with the desperate feral energy of a woman who was watching her grand scheme slip through her fingers and was fighting tooth and nail to claw it back. She slammed her hands down on the counter. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Melanie hissed, her voice echoing in the large space. "You think you can just hide all of his money in a trust and leave his biological son with absolutely nothing? But you forgot one crucial detail, Sydney. Child support is not tied to a single piece of real estate. Child support is tied to income. And I know exactly how much money you make as a senior forensic accountant." She pointed a shaking finger at my face. "I am going to take you to family court. I am going to sue your estate for retroactive child support, and I am going to garnish your wages. I am demanding $10,000 a month to maintain the standard of living this child deserves. You will pay for his private school. You will pay for his clothing. You will pay for his medical bills. You are going to cut me a check every single month for the next 18 years of his life." Trent, sensing an opportunity to salvage his shattered professional ego, quickly adjusted his posture. He cleared his throat loudly, trying to sound authoritative once more. "She is entirely correct," Trent interjected, stepping closer to Melanie and puffing out his chest. "You may have shielded the physical property with an irrevocable trust, but your husband's estate is still legally responsible for his offspring. The court will look at your joint earning history. They will look at your current corporate salary. A judge will not hesitate to attach a garnishment order to your business accounts to ensure the welfare of a minor child. You can fight the will, Sydney, but you cannot fight biology. The DNA test is absolute." I shifted my gaze from Trent to Jamal. My brother-in-law looked completely broken. He was staring at the folded piece of paper on the counter as if it were a venomous snake. His broad shoulders slumped, and he held little Leo a bit tighter to his chest. The betrayal was crushing him alive. He had spent the last year changing this boy's diapers, waking up in the middle of the night to feed him, loving him with every ounce of his soul. Now his wife was aggressively fighting to prove that the child belonged to a dead man solely to extract a monthly paycheck. "Melanie," Jamal whispered, his voice cracking with a profound, hollow grief. "Are you really doing this? Are you really standing in our home using the son I have raised to extort your own sister?" Melanie did not even look at her husband. She kept her burning, resentful eyes locked entirely on me. Her greed had completely consumed her. The golden child was throwing a tantrum because she had been denied her prize, and she was willing to burn her entire marriage to the ground just to make sure I suffered. "Pick it up, Sydney," Melanie demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "Read it out loud for everyone. Read the part where it says Leo shares a direct genetic match with the paternal line." Read the undeniable proof that your husband was a liar and a cheat. I did not rush. I maintained my absolute calm, channeling the cold analytical detachment that made me so effective at my job. In my line of work, fraudsters always rely on shock value. They throw a piece of paper in your face and scream that it is definitive proof, hoping the sheer volume of their aggression will prevent you from actually reading the fine print. I reached out and picked up the folded piece of paper. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing out the creases on the marble counter. I scanned the document. It was exactly what I expected. It was not a court-ordered chain of custody paternity test from a certified medical laboratory. It was a brightly colored printout from a cheap direct-to-consumer online ancestry website, the kind of kit you buy at a pharmacy for $50 and mail off in a cardboard box. I read the highlighted section. It did not explicitly name Declan. It did not confirm direct paternity. It simply stated that there was a high probability of a familial DNA match within the immediate biological tree. It was vague, scientifically flimsy in a legal setting, and completely circumstantial. I let out a soft, dismissive sigh and dropped the paper back onto the counter as if it were a piece of trash. $10,000 a month. I repeated softly, tasting the absolute absurdity of her demand. I looked up at Melanie, my face completely devoid of the fear she so desperately wanted to see. You want me to fund your extravagant lifestyle for the next 2 decades based on a $50 mail-in spit test? Beatrice marched up next to Melanie, her face red with indignation. A match is a match, Sydney. It proves he is family. It proves Declan is the father. You cannot deny science. I am not denying science, Mother. I replied, my voice dangerously calm. I am actually a very big fan of science. I am a fan of certified medical science. I am a fan of actual doctors' secure hospital records and irrefutable biological facts. I turned away from the cheap printout on the counter and reached down into my own thick leather briefcase, which I had placed by my feet. I unzipped the secure side compartment. Melanie and Trent watched my movements closely, their sudden confidence faltering once again. They had played their final desperate card. They thought they had backed me into a corner with a sloppy online DNA result. They had no idea that I was about to drop a medical truth that would entirely destroy their narrative, exonerate my dead husband, and expose the real father standing right next to my sister. You want to talk about biology, Melanie? I asked, my fingers wrapping around a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. Let us talk about biology. I pulled the envelope from the depths of my briefcase. It was heavy, reinforced with tamper-evident security tape, and stamped with the official insignia of Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. I did not rush the process. I deliberately caught the edge of the security seal with my fingernail and tore it open. The sharp, ripping sound echoed in the quiet room, sounding like a zipper opening a body bag. Everyone was watching my hands. Melanie had stopped breathing. Trent swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. I slid the contents onto the marble island, completely covering Melanie's cheap internet printout. These were not generic templates downloaded from a website. These were thick pages of premium medical cardstock bearing the raised embossed seals of the hospital's oncology department and the certified signatures of 3 different attending physicians. I fanned the pages out so Trent, acting as the supposed legal expert, could see the watermarks clearly. This is what real evidence looks like, I said smoothly, directing my attention to the lawyer first before turning back to my sister. Unlike your $50 mail-in kit, these records are irrefutable. They have been verified, notarized, and kept in a highly secure medical vault. I picked up the top page and held it up for the room to see. When I met Declan, he told me his deepest secret on our 3rd date. He wanted to be completely transparent with me before we got serious, because he knew it was a deal-breaker for a lot of women. He told me that we could build a beautiful life together. We could travel the world, we could adopt children, but he could never give me a biological child of our own. I looked directly at Jamal, whose eyes were wide and brimming with unshed tears. When Declan was 15 years old, he was diagnosed with an extremely aggressive form of stage 3 testicular cancer. The tumors were spreading fast. It was a matter of life and death. To save him, the surgical oncology team at Mount Sinai had to perform a radical bilateral orchiectomy. That means they surgically removed both of his testicles. Immediately after the surgery, he underwent 6 brutal rounds of chemotherapy to eradicate the cancer from his lymph nodes. I let the medical terminology settle over the room. I wanted every single guest to understand the gravity of what my husband had endured as a teenager. I wanted them to feel the weight of his survival and the absolute cruelty of my sister's accusation. Because of his young age and the sheer aggressive nature of the tumors, there was no time to harvest anything. I continued, my voice steady, but carrying a sharp edge of protective anger. He did not have the opportunity to freeze his sperm. From the age of 15 until the day he died in that car crash, Declan was 100% biologically sterile. He physically lacked the anatomy to produce a single viable sperm cell. The silence that followed my words was absolute. It was not just quiet. It was a total vacuum of sound. No one whispered. No one coughed. The sheer magnitude of Melanie's lie hung in the air, grotesque and undeniable. I turned to face my sister, stepping closer to her. She was frozen, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting back and forth like a trapped rat looking for a way out of a maze. My husband spent his entire adult life grieving the fact that he could never be a father, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried across the breathless room. It was the greatest sorrow of his life. And you stood up here today in front of our family and friends and accused him of violently forcing himself on you to conceive a child. You weaponized his greatest tragedy to try and steal my home. I pointed to the cheap DNA printout peeking out from beneath the hospital records. Your little online test might show a familial match, Melanie, but it is mathematically, anatomically, and biologically impossible for Declan to be the father of that baby. Your story is a complete fabrication. Beatrice was trembling violently. The arrogant posture she had held onto for the last 20 minutes completely collapsed. She looked at the official hospital documents, then at me, and finally at her golden child. The delusion she had carefully constructed to protect Melanie shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Even Beatrice could not argue with a bilateral surgical removal. Trent looked like he was going to be physically sick. As a lawyer, even a corrupt one, he instantly recognized the catastrophic legal liability of what had just happened. He had attached his name and professional license to a forged will that explicitly named a sterile man as a biological father. This was no longer just a failed shakedown, it was easily provable fraud. He took a slow, terrified step away from the kitchen island, trying to put physical distance between himself and Melanie. Jamal let out a ragged, agonizing breath. He looked down at Leo, gently stroking the baby's soft blonde hair, and then slowly raised his head to look at his wife. The confusion and shock were gone. They were replaced by a terrifying clarity. The medical impossibility of Declan being the father meant only one thing. Melanie had definitely cheated, and she had fabricated an entire assault by a dead man to cover her tracks and score a massive payday. If Declan could not have children, Jamal said, his voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of all the warmth and love it usually held. He took a heavy step toward Melanie. Then who is the father, Melanie? Who did you sleep with? Melanie backed away from her husband, bumping hard against the marble counter. She was trapped. Her fake tears were gone, replaced by genuine, suffocating panic. She looked wildly around the room, but there was no sympathy left. The guests who had pitied her 5 minutes ago were now glaring at her with absolute disgust. She had crossed a line that no decent human being could ever forgive. She had framed a dead, sterile man for assault. My forensic accountant brain calculated the exact moment the room shifted. The dominoes were falling perfectly. The house was safe. My husband's name was cleared, and the spotlight was now searingly hot on the real criminals. I simply stood back, folded my arms, and watched my sister's perfectly constructed life burn to ashes. The absolute silence in the living room stretched into something suffocating. 50 guests stared at Melanie, their expressions shifting from shock to a harsh, unforgiving scrutiny. The narrative she had spun about being a tragic victim of assault had evaporated completely, replaced by a glaring, undeniable reality. Declan was sterile. He could not possibly be the father of the child Jamal was currently holding, which meant Melanie had not only fabricated a sickening lie about a dead man, but she was also hiding the true identity of the man she had actually slept with. Jamal looked down at the boy in his arms. Little Leo babbled happily, reaching a tiny hand up to grasp his father's shirt, completely unaware of the devastating storm swirling around him. Jamal stared at the child's bright blue eyes and soft blonde hair. For a year, Jamal had loved this boy unconditionally. He had proudly pushed his stroller through the neighborhood, brushing off the occasional curious glances from strangers who wondered how a dark-skinned African-American man had produced a child who looked like a cherub from a Renaissance painting. Jamal had always defended his wife, trusting her implicitly. He had fought anyone who dared to question his paternity. But now the blindfold had been violently ripped off. If Declan was biologically incapable of fathering a child, the genetic puzzle became horrifyingly simple. Jamal was not the father. Declan was not the father. So who was? Melanie began to hyperventilate. The sound of her rapid, shallow breathing was the only noise in the massive custom kitchen. Her chest heaved and her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the marble island so tightly her knuckles turned white. She darted her eyes toward the front door, then toward the hallway leading to the garage. She looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for an exit, but there was nowhere to run. The guests formed a tight, impenetrable circle around the kitchen, blocking her escape. She was trapped in the center of her own disastrous lie, and she knew there was no talking her way out of medical records. Sensing her golden child was in absolute freefall, Beatrice stepped in. My mother had spent her entire life shielding Melanie from the consequences of her actions, and she was not about to stop now, even when the facts were screaming in her face. Beatrice plastered on a frantic artificial smile and turned to Jamal, waving her hands dismissively, as if we were all just misunderstanding a simple math equation. Now let us just calm down and think about this rationally, Beatrice stammered, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing awkwardly in the tense room. Genetics are a very complicated science. I read an article just the other day about recessive genes. Yes, recessive genes. You see, Jamal, you must have some distant European ancestry in your bloodline. And my grandmother had blue eyes. It is entirely possible that this is just a rare genetic skip, a medical miracle. You are the father, Jamal. You have to be. Let us just forget this whole ugly business about Declan and focus on your beautiful family. The collective cringe from the guests was almost palpable. A few people actually groaned out loud in secondhand embarrassment. It was the most pathetic, unhinged defense imaginable. Beatrice was standing in a room full of educated adults, frantically trying to explain away blatant infidelity with a mangled interpretation of high school biology. She was making an absolute fool of herself, but she did not care as long as it protected Melanie from facing the music. Jamal did not even look at Beatrice. He kept his eyes fixed intensely on his wife. The profound grief on his face was slowly hardening into something much more dangerous. It was the cold, terrifying composure of a man who had just realized his entire marriage, his home and his family, were nothing but a calculated illusion. "Shut up, Beatrice," Jamal said. His voice was incredibly low, but it commanded the room with absolute authority. "Just shut your mouth right now." Beatrice gasped, clutching her expensive pearl necklace, deeply offended that her son-in-law would dare speak to her that way. She opened her mouth to reprimand him, but she took one look at the raw fury in Jamal's eyes and wisely decided to step back, her mouth snapping shut. Jamal took a slow, heavy step toward Melanie. She shrank back against the counter, trembling violently, a stark contrast to the arrogant woman who had demanded half my house just minutes prior. "I am not going to ask you about recessive genes, Melanie," Jamal said, his words measured and precise, cutting through her panic. "And I am not going to ask you about my dead brother-in-law. I am going to ask you for the truth. You stood in our home and swore on our son's life that Declan assaulted you. You used a dead man to cover your tracks because you knew he could not defend himself, and you thought Sydney would just hand over $500,000 to keep it quiet." Melanie squeezed her eyes shut, tears of genuine panic streaming down her flushed cheeks. "Jamal, please, I was just scared. I was so scared." "Scared of what?" Jamal demanded, his voice finally rising, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings. "Scared of me finding out who you really brought into our bed. Who is it, Melanie? Who is the father of this child?" Melanie sobbed, shaking her head frantically side to side. She refused to speak. She pressed her lips tightly together, knowing that the moment she uttered his name, there would be no going back. She would lose the wealthy husband, the beautiful house, and the lavish lifestyle she had built on a foundation of lies. But she did not have to speak. The truth was standing right next to her. Jamal's eyes, wide with rage and absolute betrayal, slowly drifted away from his weeping wife. The silence in the room sharpened to a razor edge. Everyone held their collective breath as Jamal's gaze scanned the space right beside Melanie. He looked past her shaking shoulders, past the fraudulent Will sitting uselessly on the marble counter, and locked eyes with the man standing just a few feet away. Trent had been trying to blend into the background, edging slowly toward the hallway, like a thief caught in the headlights. But the sudden crushing weight of Jamal's stare froze him perfectly in his tracks. Jamal looked intensely at the lawyer. He studied Trent's pale skin. He looked at Trent's carefully styled light blonde hair. He stared directly into Trent's striking crystal blue eyes. Then Jamal slowly looked down at the baby in his arms. Pale skin, light blonde hair, crystal blue eyes. The physical resemblance was not just close, it was a flawless, undeniable copy. Standing side by side, it was like looking at a before and after picture. Jamal slowly raised his head, his eyes burning with a sudden, devastating realization. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in his mind. Trent was not just a corrupt notary hired to forge a legal document. He was not just a slimy lawyer looking for a quick payout. He was the missing variable in this twisted equation. The entire room watched in stunned, breathless silence as the ultimate betrayal finally stepped out of the shadows and directly into the light. The entire room watched in stunned, breathless silence as the ultimate betrayal finally stepped out of the shadows and directly into the light. Jamal did not scream. He did not throw a punch. The terrifying calm that had settled over him earlier crystallized into something lethal. He turned slightly gently, handing little Leo into the waiting, trembling arms of his own mother, who had stepped forward from the crowd. His mother wrapped the boy in a protective embrace, backing away to shield him from the ugly reality of what was about to happen. Once his hands were free, Jamal turned his full, undivided attention to the pale, sweating lawyer standing a few feet away. Trent realized his danger a second too late. He took a jerky step backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He bumped into a tall floor lamp, the shade rattling in the quiet room. He raised both hands in front of his chest in a weak, defensive posture. His smug, condescending smile was completely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed terror of a man caught in a trap of his own making. "Jamal, listen to me," Trent stammered, his voice cracking. "Let us be reasonable adults about this. There is a massive misunderstanding here." Jamal took a slow, deliberate step forward. "A misunderstanding," Jamal repeated softly. The sound of his voice sent a shiver down my spine. "You know, Trent, I have a very good memory for timelines. My job requires it. I design buildings for a living. I know exactly how things are constructed from the ground up. And I'm looking at the foundation of this little arrangement right now." Trent took another step back, his shoulders hitting the drywall. There was nowhere left to go. The crowd of party guests had formed a solid human barricade behind him. Nobody was going to step in to save him. "You showed up exactly 2 years ago," Jamal said, his voice gaining volume and heavy with dark realization. "Melanie told me she met a brilliant local attorney at a charity luncheon. She insisted my architecture firm needed better local representation. She insisted we needed you on retainer for our personal estate planning. I trusted my wife. I signed your checks." Jamal closed the distance, standing mere inches from Trent. The lawyer was visibly shaking now. Beads of sweat were rolling down his forehead, soaking into his stiff white collar and ruining his perfect silk tie. "Then you became a permanent fixture in my home," Jamal continued, his tone sharp and accusatory. "You were not just our lawyer. You became the family friend. You started showing up for Tuesday night dinners. You drank my expensive wine. You sat on my patio and asked me detailed questions about my business trips. You always knew exactly when I was going to be out of town, checking on out-of-state construction sites. And right around the time I went to Seattle for that 2-week commercial project, the exact time Melanie just claimed Declan was in this house, you were the one who stopped by to drop off legal paperwork. You were here, in my house, while I was working 80-hour weeks to provide for my family." Trent swallowed hard, his blue eyes darting frantically toward the crowd, looking for anyone to intervene. Even my mother Beatrice stood frozen in shock, her hands clamped over her mouth as the undeniable truth washed over her. "I will call the police, Jamal," Trent squeaked out, trying desperately to summon a shred of his former legal authority. "If you lay a single hand on me, I will have you arrested for assault. I will sue you for everything you own." Jamal did not blink. He reached out with both hands and grabbed Trent by the lapels of his tailored gray suit. He did not just hold him. He lifted the lawyer slightly off his feet and slammed him hard against the wall. The impact rattled the framed family photographs hanging nearby. "Sue me!" Jamal roared, his restraint finally snapping completely. "You came into my home. You ate my food. You slept with my wife in my bed. You fathered a child and let me raise him as my own for an entire year. And then you had the absolute audacity to stand in my kitchen, forge a dead man's signature, and try to extort my grieving sister-in-law for $1 million to cover your tracks. You have already ruined my life. Now I want the absolute truth. Say it." "Jamal, please," Melanie shrieked from across the room, taking a desperate step forward. "He is lying. Sydney is lying. They are all lying to you." "Do not speak," Jamal barked over his shoulder. The sheer force of his voice stopped Melanie dead in her tracks. He turned his terrifying glare back to the man pinned against the wall. "Look at the boy, Trent. Look at the pale skin. Look at the blonde hair. Look at the genetic carbon copy of your own face. Tell me right now, are you sleeping with my wife?" Trent was hyperventilating, his feet scrambling uselessly against the floorboards. He was a coward who preyed on vulnerable people using legal intimidation and fraudulent paperwork. He had never faced a physical consequence in his entire life. Staring into the eyes of a man whose life he had just annihilated, Trent completely broke. His survival instinct kicked in, and he did what cowards always do. He threw his partner under the bus. "It was her," Trent blurted out, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "It was Melanie. She came on to me. She said you were always working. She said you ignored her. It just happened. I swear to God, it just happened." The collective gasp from the room was like a vacuum sucking all the air out of the space. Jamal's grip tightened on Trent's lapels, his knuckles turning white. "How long?" Jamal demanded. 2 years. Trent sobbed, his slick professional facade completely destroyed. "We have been sleeping together for 2 years, ever since she hired me. The baby is mine. Leo is mine. She knew he was mine the day he was born. We panicked. She did not want to lose your money and your lifestyle. When Declan died, she came up with the plan. She said we could frame him and get half the house so we could finally run away together with a massive payout. It was her idea. The fake will was all her idea. Please do not hurt me." Trent's confession spilled out in a rapid, uncontrolled waterfall of pathetic excuses. He confirmed every single detail. He confirmed the timeline. He confirmed the 2-year affair. He confirmed the paternity of the child. And most importantly, he confessed out loud in front of 50 witnesses to the criminal conspiracy they had cooked up to extort my trust fund. I stood back and watched the destruction. My forensic audit had brought them to the precipice, but Trent's sheer cowardice had just pushed them over the edge. Jamal released his grip in absolute disgust. Trent slid down the wall and crumpled onto the floor like a discarded puppet, gasping for air and straightening his ruined silk tie. The entire room erupted into a cacophony of gasps, horrified whispers, and angry murmurs. The elegant first birthday party had officially devolved into a crime scene. Melanie snapped out of her paralyzed shock and lunged toward Trent. Her face was contorted with a vicious, ugly rage. She kicked at his expensive leather shoes, screaming at the top of her lungs. She called him a liar, a coward, and a pathetic excuse for a man. She tried to backtrack, shouting to the crowd that Trent was obsessed with her and had fabricated the entire story because she rejected him. But her frantic denials fell on deaf ears. The undeniable physical resemblance between the lawyer and the baby was burned into everyone's retinas. The truth was out, and it was entirely grotesque. Jamal stood perfectly still amidst the chaos. He did not look at his wife, who was currently shrieking on the floor. He did not look at the lawyer cowering against the baseboard. He slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. "You knew," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the noise of the room with absolute clarity. "You knew about Trent. You knew about the baby." I met his heartbroken gaze with a calm, steady nod. I walked back over to my heavy leather briefcase sitting on the floor by the kitchen island. "I did not know about the baby until she pulled that fake DNA test today." I admitted, zipping open the main compartment. "I am an accountant, Jamal, not a geneticist. But I did know about the affair, And I knew about the massive financial conspiracy she was running right under your nose. That is the real reason I came to this party today. I reached inside the briefcase and pulled out a thick, bright red folder. It was the kind of folder I used when presenting evidence to federal investigators. It commanded immediate attention. The room quieted down again, the guests sensing that the final, most devastating blow was about to be delivered. I walked over and handed the red folder directly to Jamal. He took it with trembling hands. He opened the cover and stared at the top page. It was a comprehensive ledger, highlighted with bright yellow and pink markers detailing a complex web of wire transfers. Exactly 1 month ago, I told the silent room. Jamal called me. He asked for my professional help as a forensic accountant. He had noticed some strange discrepancies in his business accounts and his joint savings. Nothing overly obvious, just a few $1,000s missing here and there. He thought maybe his bookkeeping software was glitching or perhaps he had become disorganized with his vendor payments. He asked me to run a quiet off-the-books audit just to make sure his architecture firm was secure. I looked at Melanie, who had completely stopped screaming. She was staring at the red folder in Jamal's hands as if it were a ticking time bomb. All the blood drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. She knew exactly what was inside that folder. I spent the last 4 weeks digging through your financials, Jamal. I continued, my voice steady and clinical. And what I found was not a software glitch. It was a highly sophisticated, systematic embezzlement scheme. Over the past 2 years, exactly coinciding with the timeline of this pathetic affair, Melanie has been secretly funneling money out of your accounts. Jamal flipped to the second page, his eyes scanning the highlighted numbers. His jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth might crack. She did not just take a few $100s for shopping trips, I explained, ensuring every guest understood the sheer magnitude of the theft. She set up 3 dummy limited liability companies using forged signatures. She routed small, untraceable increments of your money into these shell companies, and from there the money was wired directly into offshore accounts controlled by Trent. Trent let out a pathetic whimper from the floor. He pulled his knees up to his chest, trying to make himself as small as possible. Why would a supposedly successful lawyer need to steal from an architect? I asked rhetorically, pacing slowly in front of the kitchen island. Because Trent is not a successful lawyer. He is a degenerate gambler. He owed massive debts to some very dangerous underground bookies in the city. They were threatening to break his legs and report him to the state bar. He needed cash fast. And Melanie, eager to keep her secret lover happy and her affair hidden, decided to play sugar mama using her husband's hard-earned money. I pointed to the final page in the red folder Jamal was holding. The total amount stolen over the last 24 months is exactly $150,000, I stated clearly. And the most recent transfer, a lump sum of $10,000, moved just 4 days ago. That money was paid directly to Trent to fund the creation of that fraudulent will on the counter. Jamal closed the red folder. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. They panicked. I told Jamal, speaking only to him now. You were getting close to noticing the missing 150,000. You asked me to look into the accounts. Melanie knew I would find the missing money eventually. They needed a massive influx of cash to quietly replace what they had stolen before the audit was finished. When Declan died, they saw their golden opportunity. They thought they could forge a will publicly, shame me, steal half of my $1 million house, replace the money they stole from you, and run off with the remaining $350,000 in pure profit. I turned my back on my sister and the lawyer. I had exposed every single layer of their deceit. This is no longer a messy divorce, Jamal. I concluded, my tone shifting from familial to strictly professional. This is felony wire fraud. This is grand larceny. This is conspiracy to commit extortion. Melanie is not just a cheating wife, she is a felon. The word hung heavily in the air. Felon. It stripped away all the country club glamour, all the expensive designer clothes, and all the arrogant entitlement my sister had worn her entire life. It reduced her to exactly what she was, a criminal. Beatrice, who had been listening to the financial breakdown in absolute horror, took a sudden dramatic step away from Melanie. For the first time in 30 years, my mother looked at her golden child, not with adoration, but with pure, unadulterated self-preservation. The threat of federal prison had completely shattered her maternal loyalty. She wanted absolutely nothing to do with the sinking ship. Melanie looked up at Jamal, her eyes wide with a terrifying new reality. She was not going to get half my house. She was not going to get child support. She was looking at a decade behind bars. Jamal stood incredibly still, holding the red folder. The grief and shock that had paralyzed him earlier were completely gone. They had burned away, leaving behind a cold, calculating resolve. He slowly placed the red folder onto the marble counter, right next to the fake DNA test and the forged will. He took a deep breath, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, and then he looked down at his wife. The woman he had loved unconditionally for the past 4 years was entirely gone, replaced by a stranger he no longer recognized. Jamal looked down at Melanie, with a gaze so incredibly devoid of warmth, it sent a chill through the entire room. He did not yell. He did not need to. The sheer magnitude of his absolute detachment was far more terrifying than any shouting match could ever be. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and calmly pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen to wake it up and held it out not for the crowd to see, but specifically for his wife. The bright glow of the screen illuminated her tear-stained, panicked face. "Sydney called me at 8 o'clock this morning." Jamal said, his voice steady and clinical, carrying the cadence of an executive dismantling a failing corporation. "She gave me the final figures of the audit. I did not know about your twisted paternity cover-up or the forged will until you decided to make a spectacle of yourself 20 minutes ago. But I did know you were a thief. I knew you had been stealing from me to fund a secret life, and I spent my entire morning making sure you will never touch another dime of my money again." Melanie stared at the phone screen, her breathing shallow and ragged. She blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to comprehend the reality of his words. Jamal swiped his finger across the screen, pulling up a series of confirmation emails from his private wealth management firm. "As of 9 o'clock this morning," Jamal stated, making sure his voice carried to the back of the room so every single guest understood the finality of the situation. "Every single joint account we shared has been completely frozen. I canceled your platinum credit cards. I revoked your authorized user status on my business accounts. I locked you out of the banking apps, changed the security questions, and transferred all liquid assets into a secure single-signature holding account. You have absolutely zero access to my wealth. You cannot buy a cup of coffee with my money right now." Melanie gasped, scrambling backward on the floor until her back hit the base of the kitchen cabinets. She frantically reached for her designer purse resting on a nearby chair. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely operate the zipper. She pulled out her own phone, her manicured fingers slipping against the glass as she desperately opened her mobile banking application. The guests watched in profound silence as Melanie stared at her screen. A bright red error message popped up. "Access denied." She tried another bank app. "Account suspended." The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. The realization crashed into her with the force of a freight train. She was officially cut off. She was entirely broke. "I did not stop at the bank," Jamal continued, refusing to give her a single second to catch her breath. He swiped to the next document on his phone. It was a PDF, stamped with an official court seal. "I called my attorney. A real attorney, not the pathetic gambling degenerate currently cowering against my wall. I instructed my legal team to file an expedited petition for divorce. It was submitted electronically to the county clerk before the first guest even arrived at this party." The word divorce hung heavy in the air, severing the final thread of their marriage. Melanie let out a loud, pathetic sob, dropping her useless phone onto the hardwood floor. "The filing is fault-based," Jamal explained ruthlessly. "The grounds are infidelity, gross financial fraud, and embezzlement. I am submitting the forensic audit as Exhibit A. I will not pay you a single cent in alimony, Melanie. In fact, I am suing you in civil court for full restitution of the $150,000 you stole from me. You are going to pay me back every single penny, even if the judge has to garnish your minimum wage paychecks for the rest of your miserable life." Melanie scrambled to her knees, clasping her hands together in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Jamal, please, this is my home. You cannot do this. We are married. This house belongs to both of us. You cannot just throw me out on the street." Jamal let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a cold sound that held absolutely no amusement. He looked around the massive custom-built kitchen, his eyes scanning the vaulted ceilings and the expensive finishes he had personally designed. "You really should have paid more attention when I was talking about my work," Jamal said, shaking his head in absolute disgust. "I bought this acre of land 3 years before I even met you. I drafted the blueprints, secured the permits, and funded the entire construction through an independent LLC that is registered solely in my name. The deed to this property is held in a trust established long before our wedding day. You never contributed a single dollar to the mortgage. You have absolutely zero equity in this real estate. This is not marital property, Melanie. This is my house." He stepped back, creating a definitive physical boundary between them. He lifted his left arm and deliberately checked his expensive silver wristwatch. "It is currently 2:15 in the afternoon," Jamal announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You have exactly 1 hour. You will go upstairs, take 2 suitcases, and pack your clothes. You will not touch the jewelry I bought you. You will not take the electronics. You will only take your personal garments." He turned his piercing glare away from Melanie and locked eyes with Trent, who was still slumped pathetically against the wall. The lawyer flinched violently under Jamal's stare. "And you," Jamal barked at Trent, pointing a sharp finger at his chest, "you are going to help your mistress carry her bags out to her car. You wanted to play the provider for her and your biological son so badly, Trent. Congratulations, you won the prize. She is entirely your financial responsibility now. I hope the underground bookies give you a payment extension so you can afford to feed her." Trent swallowed hard, nodding rapidly, completely terrified of provoking the architect any further. He slowly scrambled to his feet, keeping his hands visible, looking like a beaten dog. Jamal turned back to face the center of the room. He addressed both of them for the very last time. "If you are still standing inside my house or on my driveway at 3:15, Jamal stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly tone, "I will call the local precinct, I will show them the property deed, and I will have both of you physically dragged out of here in handcuffs for criminal trespassing. Your 60 minutes starts right now. Get out of my sight." Jamal did not wait for a response. He turned his back on his ruined marriage, walking away with his spine perfectly straight and his dignity entirely intact. He walked straight past the trembling lawyer and the sobbing woman on the floor. He crossed the living room, heading directly toward his mother, who was softly rocking the baby in the corner. The party was officially over. The guests, who had stood frozen like statues watching the brutal execution of Melanie's perfectly curated life, began to shift. The silence broke into a low, buzzing murmur as people quickly grabbed their coats and purses. No one looked at Melanie with sympathy. No one offered to help her. They actively stepped around her, avoiding eye contact, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of her crimes. Even Beatrice, our mother, turned on her heel and practically sprinted for the front door without saying a single word of comfort to her golden child. I stood by the kitchen island, slowly zipping up my leather briefcase. The forensic audit had served its exact purpose. I watched Trent scurry over to Melanie, grabbing her arm and frantically pulling her toward the staircase, his eyes darting toward the clock on the wall. They were broken, humiliated, and running out of time. The guests scrambled out the front door, leaving behind half-eaten slices of birthday cake and half-empty glasses of expensive champagne. Within 5 minutes, Jamal's magnificent custom-built home felt like an abandoned museum. The only people left in the expansive living room were me and my mother. Beatrice stood near the entryway, her hands tightly gripping her designer handbag. She was watching the grand staircase where Melanie and Trent had just disappeared. I watched my mother's face closely. If you have never dealt with a true narcissist, you might expect a mother in this situation to run up those stairs, wrap her arms around her weeping daughter, and offer her a place to live. You would expect unconditional love. But maternal love in my family was never unconditional. It was a currency strictly tied to performance status and public perception. For 30 years, Melanie had been the golden child because she looked the part. She married wealthy men, she threw lavish parties, and she gave my mother a shiny, successful daughter to brag about at the country club. But as Beatrice stared at the empty staircase, I could practically see the gears turning in her head. She was running a ruthless internal calculation. Melanie was no longer a wealthy socialite. Melanie was a soon-to-be divorced, disgraced adulterer, facing felony wire fraud charges and a civil lawsuit that would bankrupt her for the rest of her life. Melanie was no longer a trophy. She was a massive radioactive liability, and a narcissist will completely sever a limb before they let an infection ruin their own image. Halfway up the stairs, Melanie stopped. She turned around, clutching the oak banister, her mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She looked down at our mother with desperate, pleading eyes. "Mom!" Melanie sobbed, her voice echoing in the quiet house. "Mom, please, can I come stay with you? Just for a few weeks until I figure this out. I cannot go to a hotel. I do not have any credit cards. Jamal blocked everything. Please, Mom." Beatrice stiffened. She took a physical step backward, creating distance between herself and the stairs. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Stay with me," Beatrice snapped, her voice sharp and completely devoid of empathy. "Are you out of your mind?" "I live in a respectable condominium complex, Melanie. What do you think my neighbors would say when they see my daughter dragging her trash bags up my driveway after being thrown out by her husband for sleeping with a corrupt lawyer?" Melanie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. It was the ultimate betrayal. The one person who had enabled her horrible behavior for her entire life was now slamming the door firmly in her face. "You embarrassed me," Beatrice yelled up the stairs, pointing an accusing finger at her favorite child. "You stood in this beautiful house and made an absolute fool of yourself. You forged a legal document. You stole money. You tried to frame a dead man for assault in front of all of my friends. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? My phone is going to be ringing off the hook tomorrow. I will not be able to show my face at my book club for a year because of your profound stupidity." "You told me to fight for the house," Melanie screamed back, completely breaking down. "You were right there with me, Mom. You held my hand when I ordered the DNA test. Do not you dare drag me into your criminal behavior," Beatrice shrieked, her survival instincts kicking into overdrive. "I thought you had a legitimate claim. I trusted you. But you are nothing but a common thief and a liar. You made your bed with that pathetic lawyer and now you can go sleep in it. Do not call me. Do not come to my house. I will not be dragged down to the bottom of the ocean with you." Melanie let out a wail of absolute despair, a harrowing sound of a woman realizing she was entirely alone in the world. She turned and ran up the rest of the stairs, disappearing into the master bedroom to pack whatever scraps Jamal was allowing her to take. Beatrice stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, adjusting the collar of her silk blouse. She smoothed her hair, composed her features, and then slowly turned around to face me. The transformation was chilling to witness. The vicious, screaming woman vanished in the blink of an eye. In her place was a sweet, maternal, deeply concerned mother. She walked over to where I was standing by the kitchen island, forcing a soft, sympathetic smile onto her lips. She reached out and tried to place her hand gently on my forearm. I took a slow step backward, making sure her fingers only grasped empty air. Beatrice pretended not to notice my rejection. "Oh, Sydney," she sighed, shaking her head as if we had just shared a traumatic bonding experience. "I simply cannot believe the monster your sister has become. I am in absolute shock. To think she would try to use poor Declan's tragic passing to line her own pockets. It is sickening. Simply sickening." I did not say a word. I just stared at her, letting the silence highlight her incredible hypocrisy. Less than 30 minutes ago, she had physically grabbed my wrist, called me a barren robot, and tried to force me to sign away my home to the very daughter she was now calling a monster. "You know," Beatrice continued, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I always knew there was something off about her. Even when she was a little girl, she was so greedy. But you, Sydney, you have always been the smart one. You have always been so capable and strong. I was just playing along earlier to see how far she would go. I knew my brilliant forensic accountant daughter would figure it all out and put her in her place." The sheer delusion required to rewrite history so blatantly was almost impressive. She genuinely believed that if she just spoke the words with enough affection, I would completely forget decades of emotional abuse and the physical assault I had just endured. Beatrice took another step closer, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, seeing all this ugliness today really puts things into perspective. Family is so fragile. Life is so short. And you have been entirely alone in that massive house since Declan passed. She paused, looking around Jamal's kitchen, as if she were inspecting real estate. My lease is actually up at the end of the month, Beatrice said, finally arriving at the true purpose of her sudden pivot. And those condo fees are getting absolutely ridiculous. I was thinking, since you have that gorgeous, fully paid off $1 million property all to yourself, it makes perfect sense for me to move in with you. I could take the guest suite on the first floor. I could cook for you. I could keep you company while you grieve. It is not safe for a young widow to be living all alone in a gated community anyway. We could finally have that mother-daughter bonding time we always missed out on. She smiled brightly, folding her hands together under her chin. She was entirely serious. She had just watched me systematically destroy a legal extortion plot, and her immediate takeaway was to try and manipulate her way into free room and board in my luxury home. She honestly thought I would welcome my primary abuser into my sanctuary simply because we shared a bloodline. I looked at the woman who had stolen my college tuition. I looked at the woman who had watched my sister try to destroy my dead husband's legacy and cheered her on. I slowly picked up my leather briefcase, my face setting into a mask of pure ice. I looked her dead in the eyes, preparing to deliver a reality check that would shatter her delusional world permanently. "You are not moving into my house, Beatrice," I said, my voice dangerously soft yet carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute finality. Beatrice's fake, sugary smile faltered, her perfectly manicured fingers twitching in the empty air between us. "Sydney, do not be dramatic. We are family. You need me right now." "I do not need you," I corrected her, stepping closer so she was forced to look directly into my eyes. "I never needed you. And as of this exact moment, we are no longer family." She gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace in her signature gesture of manufactured shock. "You cannot mean that. I am your mother." "You gave birth to me," I replied coldly. "But you have never been a mother to me. A mother protects her children. You only ever protected your own ego, and you used Melanie as your shiny little proxy to do it. You want to talk about family? Let us talk about what this family has actually done to me." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to dismantle her. I used the same clinical, methodical precision I used to audit fraudulent corporate accounts. I laid out her emotional crimes for the entire room to hear. A few guests who had lingered near the entryway, unable to tear themselves away from the sheer drama of the fallout, pulled out their smartphones. I saw the red recording lights blink on. I did not care. In fact, I welcomed it. I wanted this moment documented. I wanted the truth of who she was permanently cemented in the digital world. "When I was 18, you stole $18,000 from my bank account," I stated clearly, watching her face pale as the camera lenses focused on her. "You drained the college fund I worked 2 grueling minimum wage jobs to build, just so you could pay for an extravagant destination wedding for a daughter who divorced the guy 24 months later. You told me I was selfish for wanting an education. You told me to go to community college because Melanie's happiness was the only thing that mattered." "That was a long time ago," Beatrice stammered, looking nervously at the glowing phone screens pointing in her direction. She adjusted her posture, trying to look dignified, but her panic was bleeding through. "You are wealthy now. You got your degree. You have a successful career. Why are you bringing up ancient history to embarrass me?" "Because your toxic enabling created this exact monster," I said, gesturing toward the stairs where Melanie was currently throwing her expensive clothes into suitcases in a blind panic. "You spent 30 years teaching her that there are absolutely no consequences for her actions. You taught her that she could steal, lie, cheat, and manipulate, and you would always sweep it under the rug as long as she looked pretty for your country club friends. You cheered her on today. You stood in this kitchen, grabbed my arm, called me a barren robot, and told me to hand over half my house to a woman who fabricated a violent sexual assault by my dead husband." Beatrice swallowed hard, taking another physical step back. She was finally realizing that her narcissistic charm, the weapon she had used to control every narrative her entire life, had zero effect on me. "And now," I continued, my voice dripping with absolute unfiltered contempt, "when your precious golden child is facing a decade in federal prison and crippling financial ruin, your immediate instinct is to abandon her like a piece of trash. And then you turn around and try to leech off the daughter you spent your entire life treating like garbage. You are not a mother, Beatrice. You are a parasite. You move from host to host, sucking them dry until there is nothing left. How dare you speak to me like that? She screeched, her carefully constructed facade completely shattering into a million pieces. The ugly, vicious woman from 20 minutes ago was back, her face twisted in an ugly rage. I gave you life. I raised you. You owe me your respect. I owe you absolutely nothing, I shot back, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the custom kitchen. And you are never going to receive another ounce of my energy, my time, or my money. I am officially done playing this sick game. I adjusted my grip on my heavy leather briefcase, standing tall and unshakable. I was about to set the ultimate boundary, a wall made of reinforced steel that she would never be able to breach. Listen to me very carefully, Beatrice, because I will only say this once, I commanded, locking my cold gaze with her terrified eyes. If you ever call my phone, I will block the number immediately. If you try to contact me through my accounting firm, I will have building security escort you out and ban you from the premises. And if you ever, even for one single second, set your foot on the driveway of my property, I will not hesitate to call the local police precinct. I will have you arrested for criminal trespassing, and I will press maximum charges without a second thought. You are completely dead to me. Dead, too. Beatrice opened her mouth to scream, to hurl another barrage of toxic insults, but no words came out. The absolute, unyielding conviction in my voice paralyzed her vocal cords. She looked at the guests who were still actively recording her humiliation, capturing every angle of her defeat. She realized with crushing, undeniable certainty that she had completely lost control. The scapegoat had just permanently severed the chain. I turned my back on her and walked toward the front door. Jamal was waiting for me in the grand foyer. He had already gathered his car keys in a small leather overnight bag. He was leaving his own house to give Melanie her 1 hour to pack and get out, refusing to breathe the same air as the woman who had systematically destroyed his life. He looked at me, a silent, profound understanding passing between us. We were both survivors of the exact same toxic family dynamic, and we were both walking away from the wreckage today, choosing peace over blood. As I reached for the heavy oak front door, a loud, harrowing wail echoed down the grand staircase. Melanie had collapsed on the top landing. She was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching a designer dress to her chest, begging Jamal to come back, begging our mother to help her. Her cries were the pathetic, desperate sounds of a woman realizing her entire world of lies had just burned to ashes around her. I stepped out onto the front porch, the warm afternoon sun hitting my face like a physical blessing. Jamal walked out right beside me, closing the heavy door behind us. Behind the wood, Beatrice finally found her voice. She burst through the front door, standing on the threshold, screaming my name at the top of her lungs. "You cannot do this to me!" Beatrice shrieked, waving her arms frantically as the neighbors started to peek out from their perfectly manicured lawns to watch the spectacle. "I am your mother. You come back here and show me some respect, you ungrateful brat. I will ruin you." I did not stop walking. I did not turn around. I walked straight down the long paved driveway toward my car. Jamal walked to his own vehicle parked nearby, giving me a final respectful nod before getting in. The sound of Beatrice screaming in the driveway faded into the background, drowned out by the peaceful rustling of the wind through the suburban oak trees. Several party guests followed us out, holding their phones up, capturing every single second of my mother's unhinged public meltdown. The high-definition footage of her screaming on the porch while her criminal daughter sobbed inside would undoubtedly be circulating through her entire social circle by dinner time. Her precious reputation, the only thing she truly cared about, was permanently destroyed. I unlocked my car door and slid into the quiet sanctuary of the driver's seat. I placed my briefcase on the passenger side, resting my hands on the steering wheel, and took a deep, cleansing breath. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since childhood was entirely gone. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the toxicity in my rearview mirror forever. It has been exactly 3 months since that explosive afternoon at the suburban estate. The legal system is often criticized for moving slowly, but when you hand a team of federal prosecutors a perfectly organized forensic audit, meticulously highlighted and cross-referenced in a bright red folder, the wheels of justice spin with terrifying speed. The fallout from the birthday party was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Trent was the very first domino to fall. His arrogance had completely blinded him to the severity of his crimes. The State Bar Association did not even wait for the criminal trial to officially conclude before they took action. Following a brief emergency hearing where the forged will and the fraudulent notary stamps were presented as evidence, Trent was permanently stripped of his license to practice law. He was publicly disbarred, his reputation in the legal community annihilated overnight. But losing his career was just the beginning of his nightmare. The financial crimes I had uncovered were far more severe. Wire fraud, especially when it involves routing stolen funds through dummy corporations into offshore accounts to pay illegal gambling debts, carries heavy mandatory minimum sentences. When the federal authorities brought the hammer down, Trent folded immediately. He accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial, completely throwing my sister under the bus in the process. He is currently serving his sentence in a federal penitentiary, wearing a standard-issue uniform instead of his tailored silk suits. His underground bookies are still waiting for their money, but they will have to wait a very long time before he ever sees the outside of a cell block again. Melanie's descent from high society was equally spectacular, though entirely of her own making. Jamal did not bluff about a single threat he made that day. He executed his exit strategy with cold, calculated precision. The fault-based divorce was finalized with record speed. Because of the irrefutable proof of her infidelity and the gross financial fraud she committed during the marriage, the judge awarded Melanie absolutely zero alimony. She was not entitled to a single penny of Jamal's future earnings. But Jamal was not satisfied with just cutting her off. He filed a massive civil lawsuit against her to recoup the stolen $150,000. During the civil trial, Melanie tried to play the victim one last time, crying on the witness stand and claiming she was manipulated by the lawyer. The judge, having read the transcripts from the criminal investigation and seen the fake DNA test she tried to use to extort a grieving widow, was completely appalled. The court ruled entirely in Jamal's favor, issuing a heavy restitution judgment against my sister. With her bank accounts legally drained to pay back the stolen funds, Melanie found herself financially obliterated. She was forced to trade her sprawling custom-built mansion for a cramped, poorly lit studio apartment on the industrial side of town. The woman who once spent her afternoons sipping champagne at exclusive charity luncheons is now living paycheck to paycheck. To fulfill the court-ordered restitution and pay off her massive mountain of legal debt, my former golden child sister was forced to enter the workforce with absolutely zero marketable skills. She is currently working a grueling minimum wage job at a busy local diner. She spends her days wearing a stained uniform, wiping down greasy tables, and taking orders from the very same people she used to look down on. Every single month, a significant percentage of her meager paycheck is legally garnished and sent directly to Jamal's accounts. She has been completely stripped of her designer clothes, her luxury vehicles, and her precious country club status. The most poetic justice of all, however, came from our mother. True to her deeply narcissistic nature, Beatrice completely abandoned Melanie the exact moment the scandal became public record. Beatrice only loved people who were winning. She only valued family members who enhanced her own image and gave her something to brag about. A disgraced, bankrupt waitress facing wage garnishment and public humiliation was no longer useful to her. When Melanie begged her for a place to stay, Beatrice slammed the door in her face. When Melanie asked her to co-sign the lease for her tiny apartment, Beatrice blocked her phone number. They have not spoken a single word to each other since that screaming match on Jamal's front porch. Beatrice now spends her days sitting alone in her condominium, entirely isolated from the community. She tried so hard to impress because her friends have all ostracized her for her role in the disgusting extortion plot. As for Jamal, he walked out of the fire entirely unscathed financially, though he required time to heal emotionally. He retained full, undivided ownership of his highly successful architecture firm. The premarital trust held strong, completely protecting the custom-built house he loved and designed from being touched by the divorce proceedings. Most importantly, Jamal won full custody of his peace of mind. He filed the necessary legal paperwork to completely sever his ties to the child, forcing Trent to take sole financial and legal responsibility for his biological son from behind bars. Jamal is focusing on his career, designing new buildings and rebuilding a life that is authentic and free from manipulation. Through all the chaos and the legal battles, Jamal and I have remained incredibly close. We are no longer just former-in-laws connected by a marriage that fell apart. We are bonded by the shared trauma of surviving the exact same toxic people. We meet for coffee every other Tuesday at a quiet cafe downtown. We talk about our careers, our healing process, and our plans for the future. He has become the supportive, protective brother figure I always deserved, but never had growing up. We look out for each other, fiercely loyal and completely transparent. We both lost the family we thought we had, but in the ashes of that destruction, we found a genuine friendship built on absolute trust and mutual respect. I am sitting on the front porch of my home right now, as the evening sun begins to dip below the horizon. The air is cool and peaceful, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden Declan planted during our first spring here. This house, the beautiful $1 million sanctuary that my sister tried so desperately to steal, stands as a fortress of safety around me. The legal protection of the irrevocable trust ensures that no one can ever touch these walls. I am completely secure both financially and emotionally. The silence on my porch is not lonely or isolating. It is the sound of absolute hard-fought peace. Reflecting on the past 3 months, the most profound change has not been the legal victories or the satisfying downfall of the people who betrayed me. The most profound change is how my grief has transformed. When Declan first died, the sorrow was a chaotic, drowning ocean. I could barely breathe through the shock of his sudden absence. Then came the anger fueled by my sister's grotesque attempt to weaponize his death and tarnish his memory for her own financial gain. But today, the anger is entirely gone. The adrenaline of the forensic audit, the confrontations, and the courtroom battles has completely faded away. What remains in its place is a quiet, steady love. I look at the empty rocking chair next to mine, and I smile. I know I honored my husband the best way I possibly could. Declan was a kind, generous, and deeply honorable man who survived a brutal cancer diagnosis as a teenager, only to have his medical trauma mocked by a greedy sibling. He deserved to be fiercely protected. By dismantling their extortion plot, exposing the fake will, and clearing his name of that horrific assault allegation, I safeguarded his legacy. I made sure the world remembered him as the good man he actually was, rather than the monster my sister tried to invent to cover her own infidelity. I fought for him when he could no longer fight for himself, and that knowledge brings a profound comfort to my healing heart. Going through this ordeal forced me to confront a harsh reality that many people spend their entire lives trying to ignore. Society conditions us from a very young age to believe that family is everything. We are fed a constant diet of media and cultural expectations, telling us that no matter how badly your relatives treat you, you must always forgive them because they are your blood. We are told to keep the peace at all costs. We are told to turn the other cheek. We are told that walking away from your parents or your siblings is the ultimate moral failure and a sign of a broken character. I am here to tell you that is a dangerous, toxic lie. Blood does not make you family. Loyalty does. Respect does. Consistent, healthy behavior does. Sharing genetic material with someone does not give them a free pass to abuse you, steal from you, or manipulate your life. My mother and sister shared my DNA, but they treated me with less respect than a stranger on the street would. They viewed me as a resource to be exploited, a scapegoat to carry their blame, and an obstacle to be destroyed the moment I stood in the way of their monumental greed. They never loved me. They only loved what they thought they could extract from me. Cutting off toxic relatives is not a tragedy. It is a survival tactic. It is the necessary amputation of a rotting limb to save the rest of your body from a fatal infection. When I walked away from Beatrice screaming on that suburban driveway, I did not lose a loving mother. I lost an enabler and an abuser. When I watched Melanie face the severe legal consequences of her felony wire fraud, I did not mourn the loss of a sister. I celebrated the permanent removal of a parasite from my life. Walking away from people who actively plot your downfall is the absolute highest form of self-care you can possibly practice. It takes a massive amount of courage to break the cycle of generational dysfunction. It is terrifying to stand up at a crowded family event and refuse to play the victim. It is exhausting to gather the medical records, trace the stolen bank transfers, and hire the right lawyers to defend your assets. But the freedom waiting for you on the other side of that battle is worth every single second of the fight. You are allowed to build a fortress around your life. You are allowed to aggressively protect your assets, your emotional well-being, and your future. You do not owe your success to the people who actively tried to make you fail. As the streetlights finally flicker on in my neighborhood, illuminating the quiet road, I feel a deep sense of gratitude for the life I have successfully defended. I will continue to work passionately as a forensic accountant, using my specialized skills to uncover the truth and hold dishonest people accountable. I will continue to meet Jamal for coffee, celebrating our chosen family and the incredibly healthy boundaries we have both established. And I will continue to love Declan, carrying his memory forward in a life that is completely free of toxic influence. If you are listening to this right now and you are currently trapped in a cycle of family abuse, gaslighting, or financial manipulation, please hear my voice. Do not let them convince you that you are crazy. Do not let them intimidate you with empty legal threats, forged documents, or fake tears. Keep your record straight, protect your assets, and never be afraid to shine a bright, unforgiving light on the darkest corners of their lies. You have the power to write your own ending, and you have every right to walk away. Have you ever had to use the law to protect yourself from your own family? Drop your stories in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and we can all draw immense strength from each other's survival. Subscribe to the channel if you believe in fighting back and standing your ground. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your peace is worth protecting at any cost.